Good morning, students, staff, and visitors. Welcome to Semiahmoo Secondary's Remembrance Day Assembly. In a moment, Ms. Milkowski and our distinguished guests will enter the gymnasium to officially begin our assembly. To honor them, please stand, if you can, for the procession. Please be seated. We would ask that you remain quiet throughout today's proceedings and refrain from applauding, shouting, or cheering. Your respect for the meaning of this ceremony and for those we commemorate today is demonstrated by your silence. I would now like to call on stage our student presenters, Andy Guo and Quinn Snap.
Good morning. My name is Andy Guo.
And my name is Quinn Sned. We are gathered here today to show our respect and to remember the sacrifices of soldiers, veterans, peacekeepers, those who served on the home front, and everyone impacted during times of war.
We would like to acknowledge that Semiahmoo is situated on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish, including the Semiahmoo, Katzie, Stolo, and Kwantlen nations. We are proud of our relationship with the Semiahmoo First Nation, and we are in gratitude of these nations and their care for the land since time immemorial. Unceded means that these territories have never been handed over, sold, or given up by these nations, and we are currently situated on occupied lands. We would also like to acknowledge that a diverse population of people who have come to the Surrey School District and contribute to its dynamic culture.
Please rise if you are able and join us for the singing of our national anthem, led by the Senior Wind Ensemble.
With glory, mercy,
Thank you. Please be seated. Remembrance Day is a time to not only acknowledge those who have risked and lost their lives fighting in battle, but a day to also commemorate those who've had their loved ones stolen from them too soon. During times of war, millions of people are impacted by the loss of cherished children, sisters, brothers, parents, aunts, uncles, and countless loved ones. Today, we also recognize their heartache.
During the First and Second World Wars, letter writing was the primary communication between soldiers and their loved ones, helping to ease the pain of separation. The British Army Postal Service delivered over 2 billion letters during these wars. Soldiers wrote letters in spare moments, sometimes from the frontline trenches or in calmer surroundings behind the lines. Receiving letters from family and friends was also vital to morale, keeping men and women connected with the homes they had left behind to fight for our country. Many touching personal stories are vividly brought to life through letters exchanged during the First World War. The correspondence between Private William Morton and his fiancée, Emily Chiddix, reveals one of the most heartbreaking of all of these stories. Emily wrote this letter to Will before she had learned the devastating news that he had been killed in action.
My dearest Will, I feel I must write to you again, dear, although there is not much news to tell you. I wonder how you're getting on. I shall be so relieved to get a letter from you. I cannot help but feel a bit anxious, dear. I know how you must have felt when you did not get my letters for so long. Of course, I know, dear, that you will write to me as soon as you can. But the time seems so dull and weary without any news from you. If only this war was over and we were together again. It will be one day, I suppose. Please don't think I am worrying unnecessarily about you. I hold strong to my faith. I do wonder how your cousins are getting on. We're feeling a bit anxious over George, as no news has come in from him yet. We can't understand why his wife doesn't write. There's been a bit of fuss over Arthur this week. Unbeknownst to his parents, and despite being too young, he's been trying to enlist in the army. Yet when this was discovered, they forbid him from joining. They got in a fine row and are still not speaking. Well, darling, I don't have much more to say now, so I will close with the fondest love and kisses from your loving Emily. P.S. Cheer up, darling, and don't worry about me. I am quite all right. Only anxious to get your letters. There's good news in the papers. Mum and Dad send my love.
Another distressing letter comes from a mother at home to her son in battle. Here, Ruth Caroline Shaw Antliff in Montreal penned a letter to her son, Private William Shaw Antliff.
My dear Will,
She wrote in October 1918.
we were all delighted today to get your letter on September 8th and to see that you were not up at the front lines in that final week of September. However, the bombing of the hospital where you were was awful, and I'm thankful that you escaped.
Always trying to stay positive, Ruth was relieved that her 2 other sons were too young to enlist, and that William served with the field ambulance rather than the air service.
I still think that is the most dangerous job of all.
She wrote. These letters illuminate the tremendous heartache the families and loved ones back home were battling on a daily basis. The perpetual states of anxiety and fear of what may have been happening at battle drove families mad, never knowing if the ones they had cared for the most would be returning home.
Now we would like to invite our senior wind ensemble to perform Air for Band, composed by Frank Erickson. As we invite our senior wind ensemble to perform, please use this moment to reflect on the immense sacrifice and bravery of our fallen soldiers and veterans.
In moments of reflection, it may be difficult to truly understand what it is you are reflecting on if you have not been directly affected by war. This, at times, can leave us distant from the true nature of what war means.
To help us gain an understanding of the realities of war, we gratefully invite to the stage Carl Schock, who served in 1978 to 1986 during the Cold War, from ages 20 to 28. He is now a member of the Crescent Legion. He will be speaking about his own experience of returning home.
Well, just getting all my technology in order. The one thing I enjoy, having been a former military officer, is boundaries. So I've got 6 minutes, and my theme is returning home, which is the theme for your Remembrance Day. So they said a little bit about me. I actually did my basic officer training at CFB Chilliwack, which is no longer a base, back in 1978. And then they paid for the last 2 years at university, and then I became an air navigator, and finally a tactical coordinator on Sea King helicopters that fly off ships in the Navy. This was on the East Coast, out of Halifax. You see this word Cold War, and when I talked last, a lot of people think, well, what does Cold War mean? The Cold War meant that the Soviets and NATO had their finger on a little red button which could have fired off intercontinental ballistic missiles at each other. Wonderful. And thank God that that never happened. That's why it was called the Cold War, because everyone was ready and realized that if they escalated too far, then someone would press that button. And thank goodness it's never happened since Japan. So that was the Cold War. I wanted to say that Remembrance Day for me is something about history. And there's a quote by John Diefenbaker, who was the 13th Prime Minister of Canada. And he said, "There can be no dedication to Canada's future without a knowledge of its past." And I'm really, I taught at university for years, and I'm a real student of history. And I think it behooves everybody to understand something of that, and that's something of what this wonderful ceremony brings to focus. When I was asked to talk about returning home, I can't say that I was in any confrontation myself. Luckily not. I was with the Standing Naval Fleet Atlantic in Northern Europe, and we went into the Baltic for a nice cruise, and the Soviets were on one side with airships, NATO on the other side with airships like this. And I always joke with people that do wonderful cruises in the Baltic Sea today that my cruise was a little different. So you could have a feeling for the tension. The other thing that you could understand is that when you're trained to manage war. So when you go through basic training, they try to break you, actually. There's no physical or anything. It's just emotionally, with sleep deprivation, they try to prepare you for a war scenario. And that type of culture is very different from the culture I find myself in today, and even when I left the military. I would say that I have, luckily, my father-in-law is 97 years old. He lives with Janet and I, and he was at the tail end of the Second World War, 1944-45. So I can speak to someone who's had some experience, and he's a member of the Legion as well. But when I think about coming home, I wanted to go back and reflect on really what happened during the Second World War, because in the Second World War, there were a tremendous number of Canadians involved, men and women, over 1 million, and that was 10% of the population of the country. So a lot of Canadians were overseas and in Canada supporting the Second World War, supporting the Allies. And luckily, really, out of those million, only 44,000 died and 55,000 were wounded, and many suffered long-term debilitating wounds. And I think that's the stress, that's the trauma. I can't imagine, even myself, having served in the military, what it must have felt like to be on the ground as an infantry or a soldier, firing shots at each other, watching people around you die. I can't imagine what it would feel like. The only way I know is through stories, through what people tell me, or what I read in history, to empathize with those things. What I would say in way of returning home is that I feel the Canadian government did their best. Through the Veterans Charter, offering training, farm grants and loans for startup businesses to veterans, paying them a stipend in order to move forward with their life. Some businesses actually held the job for these soldiers who went overseas for when they came back. So I think it was very difficult for them to manage the transition from being in a wartime scenario, coming back home. It wasn't the financial support, it was the support and the way to dialogue between family and them, and to find a way forward. And unlike today, they didn't have all the same sort of services available to manage this. And so a lot of them had gone through what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. In the First World War, they called it shell shock and battle stress. And it requires the support of friends and families, and we all need to create that environment together. It's really not on the government to help these people shift from a culture where they're surrounded by death and war and travesty to something that is more compassionate and more understanding. So I think that was the big thing about returning home, even when I left the military myself, to make a transition from that type of environment, preparing you for war, experiencing war, to one that we live in today, which is much more accepting, much more diverse, and so on. So I'd like to close my talk saying, Jose Naraskowski said, "In war there are no unwounded soldiers. Everyone who comes back from a conflict by that has been affected." And finally, Remembrance Day is when the country stops for 2 minutes of silence to pay respects to those who gave their lives and our veterans who fought for our freedom. So that's what I wanted to leave with you today, and I hope you all have the opportunity to participate in Remembrance Day on Saturday. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shock, for your dedicated service and for sharing your story with us today.
In addition, the soldiers returning home from war carried their own battle wounds. Despite their sacrifices, many Indigenous, Black, and soldiers of color were not treated as heroes. Instead, they faced racism, prejudice, and systemic barriers that overshadowed the tremendous effort and sacrifices made by these veterans.
Yesterday, November 8th, was Indigenous Veterans Day, a time when Canada honors First Nations, Métis, and Inuit soldiers and veterans, and their long distinguished legacy of serving in the Canadian Armed Forces.
While exact statistics are difficult to determine, the rate of Indigenous participation in Canada's military efforts over the years has been impressive. These determined volunteers were often forced to overcome many challenges to serve in uniform. From learning a new language and adapting to cultural differences, to having traveled great distances from their remote communities just to enlist. The challenges they faced often extended to their post-service lives. Many Indigenous war veterans would not receive equal treatment compared to other Canadian veterans.
Furthermore, Black soldiers and soldiers of color coming home from war often returned to the same socio-economic ills and racism that they had faced before. Despite their sacrifices overseas, they still struggled to get hired for well-paying jobs, encountered segregation, and endured targeted brutality, especially while wearing the military uniform. Black veterans realized that being treated as equals was still a matter society had yet to resolve.
Today, we remember these soldiers and commit ourselves to honoring all veterans, including those who are often overlooked.
Again, on this somber day, at this sacred hour, we pause. We remember. We've convened here today to honor the lives lost during our darkest moments. We pay tribute to those who gave their lives while fighting on the front lines of warfare. The last post marks the end of a soldier's day. It pays tribute to the lost and to the fallen.
As we listen to the last post, we bow our heads and pay our respects to those who have given their lives for our freedom. It is followed by a minute of silent reflection and by the rapture, which signifies the new beginning each day brings. Please stand if you are able, and remain standing silently until you are asked to be seated.
Please be seated. The laying of the wreath is an act of respect, where we pay homage to those who have died in the many wars and other conflicts, from the 20th century to the present. Ms. Malkowski, representing Semiahmoo Secondary, will now lay the wreath.
After taking this time today to reflect on war, it is clear that war involves many layers of grief and heartache. From our soldiers embroiled in battle, to our loved ones back home, and ultimately to the emotional and physical memories the returning soldiers must carry, war touches and impacts everyone. It is important to always remember the sacrifices made by not only our fallen soldiers and veterans, but also by their supportive and frightened loved ones back at home.
On days like this, during moments like these, it becomes crucial to acknowledge the reality that war follows our soldiers home and becomes a part of who they are. And once it's over, it never really ends. The residual impact and heartbreak of war lives on in our stories and can never be forgotten, but should be honored forever.
We will end with a quote by Czeslaw Miłosz, who captures the sentiment perfectly. The living owes it to those who can no longer speak, to tell their stories for them.
This brings to a close our Remembrance Day ceremony. I would like to thank our veteran speaker, Carl Shaw, our piper, the senior wind ensemble, and our student speakers, Andy and Quint. To acknowledge Ms. Milkowski and our distinguished guests as they leave the assembly, please stand if you are able.
Flag party, and good. Every flag. Flag party, by the right way, march.
Please wait for instructions from your teacher to exit and continue to be silent until you have returned to your classroom.